It was just another cold afternoon in Ireland when an elderly woman sitting before the hearth decided to open an envelope she had kept hidden for more than 60 years. No one in the family knew that this small piece of paper was the reason her hands trembled every time she sewed, nor that every stitch in her quilt held a memory she had sworn never to reveal. But on that day, something inside her gave way, as if the entire past had decided to resurface, demanding to be heard. As the fire crackled and rain beat against the window, the woman released a sigh that seemed to carry an entire lifetime, and with a voice nearly extinguished, she murmured a phrase that made her granddaughter stop in the doorway, breathless, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. For an instant, time froze, and everything that was about to happen would transform forever, not only that family, but an entire town that believed it knew the truth. The fire in the hearth crackled in the small stone house in Ennis when Nora Flanagan ran her trembling hand over a faded woolen quilt. Each stitch had been sewn more than 60 years ago, and yet she felt the fabric breathed, as if it held voices. Her granddaughter, Awifa, asked whose scraps these were, and Nora answered with an absent smile, "People who are gone now." But when the young woman left to prepare the tea, the old woman drew the quilt onto her lap, closed her eyes and whispered, "When I was 12 years old, my parents used to say, 'We are preparing you for your husband.'" For an instant, the sound of rain on the roof seemed to cease. Nora opened a drawer and withdrew a small notebook with a worn cover, the same one she had hidden inside the quilt since her youth. The pages were yellowed and marked by ancient tears. She began to read in silence, memories of a girl who believed in love and was betrayed by those who should have protected her. Every word she read brought back faces, smells, and the cold of mornings in County Clare, when fear was as constant as the mist. Nora looked through the window and noticed her granddaughter returning with 2 steaming cups of tea. She folded the diary quickly, but something fell between the scraps, an old envelope sealed with red wax that she swore she had never seen before. Her heart raced. When Oif entered, she asked, "Gran, are you all right?" Nora tried to smile, but her hands were shaking. Inside the envelope there was only this: "For when you find the courage." The weight of those words pressed against her chest like stones. Oifie set the tea on the small table beside the armchair and noticed the color had drained from her grandmother's face. "Gran, what is it?" she insisted, but Nora simply shook her head, clutching the envelope as if it might dissolve in her hands. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets of Ennis, rattling the windows of the old stone cottage that had sheltered 3 generations of Flanagan women. Nora's fingers traced the wax seal, still intact, after all these years. Who had placed it there? And when? The quilt had been with her through every move, every winter, every loss. She had sewn it with her own hands in the months following her escape, each patch a fragment of someone she had known, someone she had lost, someone who had shaped her in ways she could never speak aloud. The blue-gray scrap in the corner, that had been from a dress her mother wore to Sunday Mass. The deep green beside it, from a shawl that once belonged to a kind neighbor who asked no questions. And the small piece of navy wool, frayed at the edges, that she had kept hidden beneath all the others, that was from him. Awif knelt beside her grandmother, her red hair catching the firelight. "Please, Gran, you're frightening me." Nora looked into her granddaughter's eyes, so young, so full of questions the world hadn't yet answered. She thought of all the secrets she had carried, the shame she had swallowed, the silence she had worn like a second skin, and she thought of the radio confession she had made only days before, when the words had poured out of her like water through a cracked dam when all of Ireland had listened to a voice that had been muted for 60 years. "There are things," Nora began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that we bury because we think they'll rot away. But they don't, love. They grow roots." She held the envelope up to the light. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable even after all this time. It was her father's hand, strong, angular, unforgiving. She had spent years trying to forget that script, the way it looked on the notes he left on her bedside table, the instructions, the warnings, the Bible verses underlined in red ink. Awifa reached out and touched her grandmother's wrist gently. "You don't have to open it if you're not ready." But Nora shook her head. "I've been ready for 60 years, child. I just didn't know it was here." With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The wax crumbled into crimson dust on her lap. Inside was a single piece of thin paper, folded once. She opened it slowly, and the words seemed to leap off the page, searing themselves into her vision. Nothing we did was in vain. One day, you will understand. The room spun. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She read it again, and again. The audacity of those words. The cruelty wrapped in false comfort. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. That same voice that had told her she was being prepared, that suffering was holy, that obedience was love. Gran? Awif's voice seemed to come from very far away. Nora folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She looked at her granddaughter, and for the first time in decades, she felt the full weight of what she had survived. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. Something I should have told your mother and her mother before her. Awif sat down on the floor beside the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. When I was a girl, Nora began, this house was not a home. It was a prison dressed up as devotion. And so she spoke. She told Awif about the mornings that began with prayers and ended with bruises, about the mother who looked away because she had been taught that obedience was survival, about the nuns at school who saw too much but said too little, about the shame that was sewn into her skin like the stitches in this quilt. When Awif finally raised her eyes, a tear fell onto the old paper, and the name written there was of someone everyone swore was dead. The envelope contained a piece of thin paper with her father's handwriting. Nothing we did was in vain. One day, you will understand. The words pierced her more deeply than any memory. Awif noticed her grandmother's pale face, but Nora only said she was tired. When her granddaughter left, she leaned against the wall, hearing the sound of rain transformed into memories, her father's heavy footsteps, her mother's sweet voice mingled with the whisper of nightly prayers. The home that everyone called devout was, in truth, an altar of fear. At school, the only one who sensed something was Sister Moira Ni Kareg, a nun with steady eyes who saw too much. One day, noticing the girl's lost gaze, the sister handed her a small crucifix and whispered, "Not all punishments come from God." The phrase remained etched in Nora's mind. That night, she wrote her first secret note and hid it in the family Bible, between the Gospel of John and Revelation. Years later, now elderly, Nora leafed through that same volume, and the note was still there. But what disturbed her most was the name signed in the corner, Liam O'Donnell, the lad who delivered fabrics to the village, and unknowingly became her only hope. The rain had turned torrential by the time Awif returned to the sitting room. She found her grandmother standing by the window, the old Bible open in her hands, its pages curled with age and damp. The leather binding was cracked, the gold lettering nearly worn away. This was the Bible that had sat on the mantelpiece throughout Nora's childhood, the one her father read from every evening before bed, his voice booming through the small house like thunder. "Gran, you should sit down," Awif said gently, but Nora didn't move. "Do you know what it's like?" Nora said, her voice distant. "To be afraid of a book? To hear the word love and feel only dread?" Awif stepped closer, uncertain how to respond. She had grown up in a different Ireland, one where the church's grip had loosened, where questions were allowed, where women could speak without permission. But she knew, from the stories whispered amongst the older generation, that her grandmother's Ireland had been something else entirely. Nora turned a page carefully, and there it was, a small piece of paper, folded so many times it had become soft as cloth. She unfolded it with the reverence one might show a relic. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible. "If you ever need help, ask for the lad with the blue thread. L." "Who was he?" Awif asked quietly. Nora closed her eyes. "Someone who saw me when I was invisible." The memory came flooding back with such force that Nora had to steady herself against the windowsill. She was 12 years old again, standing in the cold kitchen of the house in Clare, her arms covered in bruises she had learned to hide beneath long sleeves. Her mother was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, her movements mechanical, her face carefully blank. Her father was in the next room reading the newspaper, the rustle of pages punctuating the silence like a metronome of control. There had been a knock at the door that morning. Her mother had answered it, and Nora had heard a young man's voice, bright, easy, warm. It was so different from the voices she was used to that she had crept to the doorway to listen. "Morning, Mrs. Flanagan. I've the wool your husband ordered, and a few new patterns from Limerick if you'd like to see them." Her mother had invited him in, and Nora had caught her first glimpse of Liam O'Donnell. He was perhaps 17, tall and lean, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of a summer sky. He carried a large canvas bag over his shoulder, filled with bolts of fabric and spools of thread. His smile was easy, unguarded, the smile of someone who had never learned to be afraid. Nora had stepped back into the shadows, but not quickly enough. Liam's eyes had found hers, and for a brief moment, they had simply looked at one another. Then her father's voice had cut through the air. "Nora, upstairs." Now, she had obeyed, as she always did. But as she climbed the narrow staircase, she had glanced back and seen Liam watching her, a small frown creasing his brow. He had noticed. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched at her father's voice, the bruises she tried so hard to hide. The following week he had returned. This time he had asked her mother if he might leave a small parcel of thread samples in case they wanted to order more. Her mother had agreed, distracted by the laundry she was hanging. Liam had placed the parcel on the kitchen table, and as he turned to leave, he had caught Nora's eye and given the smallest nod toward the package. Later, when she was alone, Nora had opened it. Beneath the thread samples was a note hastily scrawled, "If you ever need help, ask for the lad with the blue thread. L." She had memorized the words and burnt the paper in the fireplace that same night, terrified her father might find it. But she had kept the thread, a single spool of navy blue, hidden in the hem of her dress. It had been her secret, her lifeline, her proof that someone, somewhere, had seen her suffering and cared enough to offer a way out. "Did you ever ask for help?" Awif's voice broke through the memory. Nora opened her eyes and looked at her granddaughter. "Not then. I was too frightened. But he kept coming back. And eventually," she trailed off, her gaze returning to the window. Outside, the rain hammered against the glass, distorting the lights of Ennis into soft, wavering orbs. "Eventually what?" "Eventually, he decided he couldn't wait for me to ask." Awif felt a chill run down her spine. She thought of the envelope, the note from Nora's father, the name Liam O'Donnell written in her grandmother's young hand. "What happened to him, Gran?" Nora's jaw tightened. "That's what I need to find out." She moved to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a drawer. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. She rifled through them until she found what she was looking for, a yellowed article from the Limerick Leader, dated October 1965. Local lad sought in connection with missing girl. Awif leaned over her grandmother's shoulder and read the brief text. It described how a young woman from County Clare had disappeared from her family home in the early hours of the morning, and how witnesses had seen her leave with a young man identified as Liam O'Donnell, a traveling fabric merchant. The article described him as dangerous and urged anyone with information to contact the Gardaí immediately. "They made him sound like a criminal," Awifa whispered. "They made him sound like a monster," Nora corrected, her voice hard. "But he was the only one who tried to save me." She folded the article carefully and placed it back in the drawer. Then she turned to face her granddaughter, and Ave saw something new in her eyes. Not just sorrow, but determination. "I need to find him," Nora said. "I need to know if he's still alive. And if he is," she paused, her voice breaking, "I need to tell him I'm sorry. Sorry that I let them call him a criminal. Sorry that I never fought hard enough to clear his name." Awif took her grandmother's hands in hers. "Then we'll find him. Together." Nora nodded slowly, and for the first time since opening that envelope, she felt something other than pain. She felt purpose. In 1964, summer brought a rare light to County Clare. Liam O'Donnell was the son of a widowed seamstress and traveled between farms selling fine fabrics from Limerick. Nora met him when he helped her mother lift a bale of wool. It was the first time she saw someone look at her without a shadow of guilt. He noticed the bruises on her arms, but she looked away and said she had fallen from the cart. Liam didn't believe her, and promised himself he would discover the truth. Days later, he brought her a gift, a piece of navy blue fabric, saying it matched her eyes. It was the first touch of kindness in years, but also the beginning of danger. Nora's father was watching everything, and Liam's smile ignited a fury she would never forget. That night, her mother warned her in a cold voice, "Your father already has plans. Don't toy with fate, girl." Decades later, Nora could still smell the fabric burning in the fireplace along with her innocence. The diary in her hands trembled, and she understood what Liam's note meant. He knew. He had seen. And perhaps he had tried to save her. The summer of 1964 had been unusually warm, the kind of weather that made the fields of Clare glow golden and drew people out of their gray stone houses to linger in doorways and lean against gates, talking in that unhurried way that marked the rhythm of rural life. Nora remembered it with painful clarity, not because of the sunshine, but because it was the summer she learned what hope felt like and how quickly it could be snatched away. Liam O'Donnell came to their house every Tuesday and Friday, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder, his whistle carrying across the fields before he even came into view. He was known throughout the area as the lad with the good fabrics and the easy manner, the sort of young man that mothers trusted and fathers tolerated because he was useful and respectful and never stayed too long. But Nora saw something in him that others didn't. She saw the way his eyes lingered on the bruises that darkened her skin, the way his smile faltered when her father entered the room, the way he seemed to choose his words carefully, as though he understood that in this house, language was a minefield. The day he gave her the navy fabric, she had been in the kitchen, helping her mother prepare the midday meal. Her father was out in the fields, and for once, the house felt almost peaceful. Liam had arrived with a new shipment from Limerick, and her mother had invited him in to show her the patterns. Nora had been standing by the basin, washing potatoes, when Liam approached her. He held out a folded piece of cloth, and when she hesitated, he smiled and said, "Go on. It's just a remnant. No one will miss it." She had taken it carefully, unfolding the fabric to reveal a deep, rich navy that seemed to hold the color of the evening sky. It was softer than anything she had ever touched, and for a moment she forgot where she was. "It matches your eyes," Liam had said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice had made her chest tighten. Her mother had glanced over, her expression unreadable. "That's very kind of you, Mr. O'Donnell." "Liam," he had corrected gently. "Just Liam." Nora had clutched the fabric to her chest, afraid to look at him, afraid that if she met his eyes, she would cry. No one had ever given her anything that wasn't tied to expectation or punishment. No one had ever looked at her and seen something worth protecting. But her father had seen. He had come in from the fields earlier than expected, his boots heavy on the stone floor, his shadow filling the doorway. Nora had seen his face and felt the familiar ice spread through her veins. "What's this?" he had demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Liam had turned, straightening to his full height. "Just a bit of fabric, sir. A remnant. I thought your daughter might like it." "Did you now?" Her father's eyes had moved from Liam to Nora, and she had seen the calculation there, the suspicion, the rage that simmered just beneath the surface. "And why would you be thinking about what my daughter likes?" "It's nothing, sir, just take it back." Her father had stepped forward, and Nora had instinctively moved behind her mother. "We don't accept charity." Liam had looked at Nora, and she had seen the conflict in his eyes. He had wanted to argue, wanted to defend her, but he was young and powerless, and they both knew it. Slowly, he had reached out his hand, but Nora hadn't given the fabric back. She had held it tighter, her knuckles white, her jaw set. For one reckless moment, she had defied her father, and the cost of that defiance had been swift and brutal. Her father had grabbed the fabric from her hands and thrown it into the fireplace. She had watched it catch flame, the beautiful navy blue curling and blackening, and she had felt something inside her break. Liam had left without another word, but his face had been pale, his hands clenched into fists, and Nora had known even then that he wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't forget what he had seen. That night, her mother had come to her room, a rare visit, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. "Your father has plans for you," she had said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Healy's son needs a wife. You'll be married by autumn." Nora had stared at the ceiling, her body aching from the punishment her father had delivered after Liam left. "I don't want to marry him. What you want doesn't matter." And that was the truth of it. What she wanted had never mattered. Not when she was born, not when she was beaten, not when she cried herself to sleep at night, praying for a different life. Her wants were irrelevant, her voice silenced before it could even form words. But Liam had seen her, and in seeing her, he had given her something she hadn't known she still possessed, the belief that she deserved better. Now, sitting in her armchair in Ennis, decades removed from that summer, Nora ran her fingers over the pages of her diary. The entries from those months were sparse, written in a hand that shook with fear and desperation. But one entry stood out, dated 3 weeks after the incident with the fabric. "He came to the window last night. He said he had a plan. I don't know if I'm brave enough. Oif, who had been reading over her grandmother's shoulder, looked up. A plan? What kind of plan? Nora closed the diary and stood slowly, her joints protesting. She walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small wooden box she had kept there for years. Inside was a folded piece of paper, brown with age, and a dried sprig of heather. She handed the paper to Oif. "Read it." Oif unfolded the note carefully. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged in places, but the message was clear. "Meet me at the crossroads on the 17th before dawn. I have work in Limerick. We can start again. Trust me. L." "Did you go?" Oif whispered. Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I went." And in that moment, the weight of 60 years pressed down on them both, and Oif understood that the story she was hearing was not just about the past. It was about survival and sacrifice, and the terrible price of love in a world that punished those who dared to reach for it. The date marked was 17th of October 1965. The memory returned in full. Liam knocked on the window before dawn, with a coat and a letter. "Let's go, Nora. I'll arrange work in Limerick. We just need to leave now." She hesitated. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Her father had woken. Time froze. When the door opened, Liam saw the man push the girl against the wall, and understood everything that had seemed confusing before. Nora screamed, and that scream split the air like a blade. In the chaos, her mother fell to her knees, begging her husband to stop, but was pushed aside. Liam reacted. He grabbed Nora by the hand and ran outside, with the mist covering the fields and the sound of dogs in the distance. Behind them, the echo of her father's voice mingled with the morning bells. Each step was a sentence of exile, and each breath a promise never to return. At Limerick Station, before they boarded, Liam hastily wrote something on a piece of paper and placed it in Nora's coat pocket. He said he would meet her the next day, but she never saw him arrive. The 17th of October 1965 had dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning where the mist hung so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Nora had been awake for hours, lying rigid in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, her mother's soft snoring from the room next door, her father's heavy breathing, punctuated by occasional grunts, the creak of old timber contracting in the chill. She had packed nothing. There was nothing to pack. Everything she owned had been chosen by her father, approved by her mother, marked with the stain of a life she didn't want. The only thing she carried was the small wooden rosary her grandmother had given her before she died, tucked into the pocket of her nightdress. The tap on the window had been so soft she almost missed it, but she had been waiting, every nerve alight, and she heard it. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floor, and eased the curtain aside. Liam was there, crouched beneath the window, his face pale in the pre-dawn darkness. He held up a coat, thick wool, too large for her, but warm, and mouthed the words, "Now, we go now." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had imagined 1,000 times, the escape she had dreamed of but never truly believed would come. She nodded, her hands shaking as she unlatched the window and pushed it open as quietly as she could. Liam helped her through, his hands steady and sure, and for a brief, wild moment, she felt something like joy. They were going to make it. They were going to be free. But then she heard it. The creak of a floorboard behind her. The unmistakable sound of her father's bedroom door opening. "Nora!" Her mother's voice, uncertain, afraid, and then, louder, her father's. "What's going on?" Time fractured. Nora froze, half in and half out of the window, terror flooding her veins. Liam grabbed her arms and pulled, trying to get her through, but her nightdress caught on the latch and she stumbled. The door to her room slammed open. Her father stood there, his face twisted with rage, his fists clenched. For a moment, no one moved. Then he lunged. Liam pulled harder and Nora tumbled through the window, landing hard on the damp grass. She heard her mother scream, heard her father shouting, and then Liam was pulling her to her feet, and they were running. They ran through the fields, the mist swallowing them, the wet grass soaking through Nora's thin nightdress. Behind them, she could hear her father's voice, bellowing her name, and the frantic barking of dogs. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled, but Liam's hand was tight around hers, pulling her forward, refusing to let her fall. "Don't look back," he gasped. "Just keep running." They ran until they reached the road, where Liam's mother's old bicycle was propped against a stone wall. He lifted Nora onto the seat and climbed on behind her, pedaling furiously down the narrow lane towards the main road. The dawn was breaking now, pale light filtering through the mist, and Nora could see the outline of the village church in the distance, its bell beginning to toll for morning mass. She thought of her mother on her knees in their kitchen, begging her father to stop. She thought of the life she was leaving behind, the beatings, the fear, the suffocating silence, and she thought of the life ahead, uncertain and terrifying, but hers. They reached Limerick by mid-morning, Liam pedaling until his legs gave out, then walking the bicycle the rest of the way. Nora was shivering violently by the time they arrived at the station, her nightdress still damp, her feet cut and bleeding. Liam bought her a ticket with the last of his savings and wrapped the coat tighter around her shoulders. "You'll be safe in Dublin," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I have an aunt there. She'll take you in, no questions asked. I'll follow tomorrow once I've sorted things here." Nora looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and gratitude. "What if they find you? What if they won't?" He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "I promise you, Nora. This is just the beginning. We're going to be all right." He pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket and scribbled something on it, then tucked it into the pocket of the coat. "My aunt's address. If anything happens, if I don't make it tomorrow, you go there, you hear me?" She nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. The train whistle blew. Liam kissed her forehead, a brief, chaste touch that felt like a vow, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd at the platform. Nora boarded the train alone. She found a seat in the corner of a third-class carriage, tucked the coat around herself, and closed her eyes. She was free. She was terrified. She was alive. But Liam never came. She waited at his aunt's house for 3 days, sleeping on a narrow cot in the kitchen, jumping at every knock on the door. His aunt was kind but wary, asking no questions but watching Nora with careful eyes. On the 4th day, a priest arrived with news. Liam O'Donnell had been arrested. He was being held in Limerick, charged with abduction. Nora's father had told the Gardaí that his daughter had been taken by force, that she was an innocent child corrupted by a dangerous young man. And the law, as it always did, believed the man with land and respectability over the penniless lad, with nothing but good intentions. Nora had collapsed when she heard. She had screamed and wept and beaten her fists against the floor, but it changed nothing. Liam was gone, and she, once again, was powerless to save him. Now, 60 years later, sitting in her home in Ennis, Nora pulled out the note Liam had written that day. The paper was fragile. The ink faded, but the words were still there. "If I don't make it, know that I would do it all again. You deserve to be free." Oif wiped tears from her cheeks. "Gran, we have to find him. We have to know what happened." Nora nodded slowly. "There's something else," she said. "Something I found in the diary." She flipped to the back pages and pulled out a loose sheet folded and brittle. A date and an address in Limerick. Oif took the paper and read it. Her eyes widened. "This is from last year. Someone sent this to you?" It arrived with no return address. "Just this." The note read, "He's still waiting for you." The envelope, now rescued from the lining of the quilt, bore handwriting that trembled, but was unmistakable. The name Liam O'Donnell was inscribed on the flap, and the postal stamp was from 1965. Nora opened it with hands that no longer had steadiness, but her heart beat as if she were still the girl from before. Inside, a piece of paper nearly dissolved carried the words, "If you don't see me at the station, don't believe I died. Keep this love as proof that goodness still exists in the world." For a few seconds, silence took hold of the house. The fire in the hearth seemed to shrink as if it too held its breath. Oif, intrigued, asked where this letter came from. Nora simply answered, "From someone who tried to save me." Her granddaughter noticed the gravity in her voice and, leafing through the envelope, found a second sheet. Unsigned, typewritten. A police search notice issued in the name of Liam O'Donnell, accused of abduction. The world, in that instant, turned upside down. The truth fell upon Nora like delayed thunder. The lad who loved her had been hunted as a criminal for trying to free her. She brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming. Time, which for many heals, for her only held the weight of what had never been said. The typewritten notice was official, cold, impersonal. It listed Liam's height, his age, the color of his eyes. It described him as dangerous and unstable, and it urged anyone with information to contact the authorities immediately. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a note that made Nora's blood run cold. Suspect believed to have coerced minor female into unlawful flight. Considered a threat to public morals. Public morals, Nora whispered, her voice breaking. They made him sound like a monster. A wife read the notice again, her hands shaking. But this doesn't make sense. If he was arrested, there would be a trial record. A conviction. Something. Nora shook her head slowly. There was no trial. I waited for news, but nothing ever came. His aunt told me the charges were dropped after a few weeks, but by then, the damage was done. Everyone knew his name. Everyone believed he was guilty. And you never heard from him again? Not a word. Nora's voice was barely audible now. I thought perhaps he'd moved away. Started a new life somewhere he wouldn't be recognized, I thought. She paused, struggling with the words. I thought he'd forgotten me. Oif set the notice down carefully and took her grandmother's hands. Gran, if someone sent you that message last year, the one that said he's still waiting, then he didn't forget. He never forgot. Nora looked at her granddaughter, and for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. It opened old wounds and demanded answers to questions she had buried long ago. I need to know, Nora said finally. I need to know what happened to him. Whether he's alive. Whether he... She couldn't finish the sentence. Oif stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. I'll find him, she said. I'll search every record, every archive, every care home in Ireland if I have to. But I'll find him. Nora watched her granddaughter's determined profile and felt something shift inside her chest. For 60 years she had carried the weight of Liam's sacrifice alone. She had lived with the guilt, the grief, the unanswered questions. But now, for the first time, she wasn't alone. That night, after Oif had gone to bed, Nora sat by the fire and reread Liam's letter. The paper was so fragile it threatened to crumble in her hands, but she held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. If you don't see me at the station, don't believe I died. Keep this love as proof that goodness still exists in the world. She thought of the girl she had been, terrified, broken, convinced she was worthless. And she thought of the boy who had seen past all of that, who had risked everything to give her a chance at freedom. I'm sorry, she whispered to the empty room. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. The fire crackled softly, and the rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the windows like 1,000 tiny heartbeats. And somewhere, in a place Nora couldn't yet name, Liam O'Donnell, if he was still alive, was waiting. The next morning, Oif began her search. She started with the obvious places: civil records, hospital admissions, death certificates. She called every care home in Munster, asking if they had a resident by the name of Liam O'Donnell. Most said no. Some said they'd check and never called back. But on the third day, a woman from a care home in Cork called her mobile. Her voice was kind, professional. You rang asking about Liam O'Donnell? Oif's heart leapt. Yes. Do you have him? We do. He's been with us for about 5 years now. Keeps to himself mostly. Doesn't get many visitors. Is he well? There was a pause. Physically, he's frail, but his mind is sharp. He spends most of his time in the common room working at an old sewing machine we keep for the residents. He makes little things, quilts mostly. Oif felt tears prick her eyes. Quilts? Yes. Beautiful work, too. He never sells them or gives them away. Just makes them and keeps them folded in his room. It's like he's waiting for something. Or someone, Oif thought. Can I visit him? She asked. Of course, but... The woman hesitated. He doesn't speak much about his past. If you're family, or if there's something important you need to tell him, just be gentle. He's been through a lot. Oif had promised she would be. She ended the call and immediately went to find her grandmother. Nora was in the garden, tending to the small herb patch she kept by the back door. She looked up when Oif approached, and the expression on her granddaughter's face told her everything. You found him. Oif nodded, unable to speak. Nora's legs gave way, and she sank onto the small wooden bench beneath the rowan tree. She covered her face with her hands and wept, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient, a place she had locked away for 60 years. Oif knelt beside her and wrapped her arms around her grandmother's shaking shoulders. He's alive, Gran. He's in Cork, and he's been making quilts. Nora looked up. her face streaked with tears. Quilts, just like you. And in that moment, the distance of 60 years collapsed. Two people separated by time and circumstance and the cruelty of a world that punished love had been stitching their way back to each other, one thread at a time. I want to see him, Nora said, her voice steadier now. I need to see him. We'll go, Awife promised. We'll go tomorrow. But that night, as Nora prepared for bed, a wave of dizziness swept over her. She reached for the bedpost to steady herself, but her vision blurred and the room tilted. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was Awife's voice, calling her name. 2 days later, Awife parked the car in front of St. Brigid's care home in Cork. The white walls and flowered windows did not betray the stories that slept there. She introduced herself at reception, explaining that she was looking for a former fabric seller, Liam O'Donnell. The nurse leafed through the records and nodded slowly. He's been with us for 5 years, hardly speaks, but he still sews small scraps at night. The scene was almost unreal. An old man bent over, hair completely white, sitting before a rusted sewing machine. When Awife approached and mentioned Nora's name, he raised his face, and his blue eyes, still steady, shone as if time were reversing. He didn't ask how is she, but rather, did she manage to escape? Awife felt the knot in her throat. Nora had never known he was alive, and he had never known she survived. The granddaughter promised to bring him to Ennis, but the doctor warned. Liam was fragile and his heart unstable. Even so, he insisted, "Take me. I have a piece of sewing I need to finish." The journey to Cork had been difficult. Nora had regained consciousness the morning after her collapse, but she was weak, her movements slow and uncertain. The doctor had advised against travel, but Nora had been adamant. "I've waited 60 years, she had said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not waiting any longer." So Awife had helped her into the car, wrapping her in blankets despite the mild autumn weather, and they had driven south through the winding roads of Munster. Nora had been silent for most of the journey, staring out the window at the passing landscape, the stone walls, the green fields, the distant mountains shrouded in mist. When they finally pulled into the car park of St. Brigid's care home, Nora's hands were trembling. Awife reached over and squeezed them gently. "Are you ready?" Nora nodded, though her face was pale. "I don't know what to say to him." "You don't have to say anything," Awife reassured her. "Just being here is enough." The care home was modest but well kept, with cheerful yellow curtains in the windows and a small garden out front, where a few residents sat on benches, wrapped in cardigans and shawls. Inside it smelled of tea and disinfectant and something else, the faint, indefinable scent of age and memory. The nurse at reception recognized Awife from her phone call. "He's in the common room," she said, her voice gentle. "I should warn you, though. He's been agitated since I told him someone was coming to see him. I'm not sure he understands who you are." "That's all right," Awife said. "We just need to see him." The nurse led them down a corridor lined with watercolor paintings and framed photographs of Cork in decades past. At the end of the hall, she pushed open a door to reveal a large sunlit room with clusters of armchairs and a few tables. In the far corner, beside a window overlooking the garden, sat an old man at a sewing machine. Nora stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. It was him. Even after 60 years, even with his hair gone white and his shoulders bent with age, she knew him. The shape of his hands as they guided fabric beneath the needle, the way he tilted his head slightly when he concentrated, the quiet stillness that had always surrounded him, as if he carried a secret the world wasn't ready to hear. Awife touched her grandmother's arm. "Do you want me to come with you?" Nora shook her head. "No, I need to do this alone." She walked across the room slowly, her cane tapping softly against the linoleum floor. As she approached, Liam looked up, and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sewing machine fell silent. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Liam spoke, his voice rough with disuse. "Nora." She nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. He stood slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "You're alive," he whispered. "All these years I didn't know. I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought you were dead," Nora managed. "Or that you'd forgotten me." "Forget you?" Liam's face crumpled. "Not a day went by that I didn't think of you. Not a single day." They stood there, Two old people separated by 3 feet of worn linoleum and 60 years of silence, and the weight of all that lost time pressed down on them like a physical thing. Finally, Nora took a step forward, and then another, and then she was in his arms and they were holding each other as if they were still young, as if the world hadn't torn them apart, as if love could somehow undo all the damage that had been done. "I'm sorry," Nora sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm so sorry. They called you a criminal. They destroyed your name, and I never—" "Hush," Liam murmured, stroking her hair. "None of that matters now. You're here. That's all that matters." They stood like that for a long time, and around them, the other residents watched in silence, some with tears in their eyes, others with soft smiles, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had survived everything the world had thrown at it. Eventually, Liam led Nora to a chair and sat beside her, their hands clasped tightly. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what happened after that day." So Nora told him. She told him about the days she had spent waiting in Dublin, about the priest who brought news of his arrest, about the years she had spent believing he had been lost to her forever. She told him about the life she had built, the work she had found as a seamstress, the small flat she had rented, the loneliness that had never quite left her. And Liam told her his story. He told her about the cell in Limerick, about the weeks he had spent waiting for a trial that never came, about the way people had looked at him when he was finally released, with suspicion and disgust, as if he were something dangerous and shameful. He told her about the years of moving from town to town, never staying long enough to make friends, never daring to love again. "And the quilts?" Nora asked softly. Liam smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "I started making them about 10 years ago, when my hands were still steady enough. I told myself I was just keeping busy, but—" He looked away. "I think I was trying to stitch together all the things that got torn apart, trying to make something whole out of all the broken pieces." Nora reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that time had carved there. "We were never broken, Liam. We were just scattered. But we're here now. We found each other." He covered her hand with his own. "I'm old, Nora. I'm tired. And my heart—" He tapped his chest. "It's not what it used to be. The doctors say I don't have much time. Then we won't waste it," Nora said firmly. "Come home with me. Come to Ennis. Let's finish what we started all those years ago." Liam looked at her, his blue eyes bright with tears. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Oif, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "I'll make the arrangements," she said. "We'll bring you home, Mr. O'Donnell." Liam smiled at her. "Just Liam. And thank you." As they prepared to leave, Liam insisted on bringing the quilt he had been working on. It was small, made from scraps of fabric in shades of blue and gray and green, the colors of Ireland, of sky and sea and field. "I've been working on this one for years," he said. "I always knew somehow that I'd get to give it to you." Nora took it in her hands, and as she unfolded it, she saw that he had sewn a single word into the center, in careful, even stitches. "Forever." Upon regaining consciousness, Nora asked for an impossible favor, that Aoife ring the community radio station in Ennis. "I don't want to die in silence," she said, her eyes turned towards the crucifix hanging on the wall. Hours later, the presenter announced, "Today, a lady from our town wishes to share something she has kept for 60 years. People stopped in the bakeries, in the markets, in the kitchens, and listened. With a hoarse but steady voice, Nora told her story without anger, but with a serenity that broke hearts. She spoke of her parents, of distorted faith, of stolen love, and of the only man who tried to save her. She said she forgave, but that she would never again accept silence as virtue. The radio station's phone lines jammed within minutes. Tears, messages, and prayers arrived from all over the country. It was as if all of Ireland breathed together with her. When she finished, Nora held the diary in her hands and looked at the old quilt. "There are scraps that cannot be mended," she murmured, "but we can transform them into something else." The decision to speak publicly had not been easy. After bringing Liam back to Ennis, after settling him into the small guest room that overlooked the back garden, Nora had lain awake for 3 nights, wrestling with a question that had haunted her for decades. Did her silence make her complicit? She had survived. She had built a life. She had raised a daughter, welcomed a granddaughter, sewn countless quilts that warmed countless homes. But she had never spoken the truth aloud. She had never named the violence, the control, the systematic breaking of a child's spirit in the name of God and duty and respectability. On the fourth morning, she had asked Oif to make the call. The producer at Claire FM had been hesitant at first. "Are you certain about this, Mrs. Flanagan? Once it's out there, you can't take it back." "I know," Nora had said. "That's exactly why I need to do it." They scheduled the broadcast for a Tuesday afternoon, during the slot usually reserved for local news and community announcements. The producer suggested they record it in advance, to give Nora the option to change her mind, but she refused. "It needs to be live," she insisted. "People need to hear it as it happens." Liam had held her hand as she prepared. He was sitting beside her in the small studio the radio station had set up in their sitting room, his presence a quiet anchor. "You don't have to do this," he had said gently. "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm. "For every girl who's sitting in a house like I was, wondering if she's the only one. For every boy who's watching and doesn't know how to help. For everyone who's been told that silence is holy." At 3 o'clock, the presenter's voice crackled through radios across Clare and beyond. "We have something rather special today. Mrs. Nora Flanagan from Ennis has asked to share a story with you all." "Mrs. Flanagan, thank you for your courage." Nora took a breath. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "My name is Nora Flanagan. I'm 76 years old, and I've been carrying a secret for 60 years. Today, I'm putting it down." She began at the beginning. She spoke of her childhood in County Clare, of the house that looked respectable from the outside but held darkness within its walls. She spoke of her father's fists and her mother's frightened compliance. She spoke of the beatings disguised as discipline, the isolation presented as protection, the terror masked as love. "They told me I was being prepared," she said. "Prepared to be a good wife, a good Catholic, a good woman. But what they were really doing was teaching me that I didn't matter, that my body wasn't mine, that my voice had no value." Across Clare, people stopped what they were doing. In kitchens, women turned off the taps and stood with their hands dripping. In shops, customers paused mid-transaction. In cars, drivers pulled over to the side of the road. Nora spoke of meeting Liam, of the scrap of navy fabric, of the plan to escape. She spoke of the morning they ran, of the terror and the hope, of the train station in Limerick where she waited for him and he never came. "They called him a criminal," she said, her voice breaking now. "They said he had abducted me, corrupted me, stolen me away. But the truth is, he was the only one who saw me as human. He was the only one who thought I deserved to be free." The phone lines at the station began to light up. The producer, watching the board, felt tears streaming down her face. Nora continued. She spoke of the years of silence, of building a life while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. She spoke of the radio message she had received last year, "He's still waiting," and of finding Liam in Cork, alive but alone, still stitching together the pieces of a love that should never have been torn apart. "I'm speaking today," she said, "because I want every person listening to know this. Silence is not virtue. Obedience is not love. And if someone you know is suffering, if someone you know is trapped, don't look away. Don't tell yourself it's not your business. Don't convince yourself that it's complicated." She paused, gathering herself. "I forgive my parents. I do. They were broken people, shaped by a broken system, and they did what they thought was right. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending it was all right." When she finished, there was a long moment of silence on the radio. Then the presenter spoke, her own voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Flanagan. I think you've just given a voice to thousands of people who thought they were alone." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the station's phone lines were jammed with calls from people sharing their own stories. Women in their 70s and 80s, speaking for the first time about childhoods marked by violence and control. Younger people, recognizing the patterns in their own families, asking for help. Men, confessing their own complicity, asking how to do better. The local newspaper ran the story the next day. Then the national papers picked it up. By the end of the week, Nora's face was on the front page of the Irish Times, beneath the headline, "The Woman Who Refused to Die Silent." Journalists requested interviews. Advocacy groups asked her to speak at events. The Taoiseach's office sent a letter commending her courage. But Nora declined most of it. She had said what she needed to say. Now she just wanted to live. That evening, as the sun set over Ennis, Nora and Liam sat together in the back garden, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. Oif brought them tea and biscuits, then left them alone. "You were magnificent," Liam said softly. Nora smiled. "I was terrified. That's what makes it magnificent." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for evening mass, and Nora thought of all the prayers she had whispered as a child, begging for rescue. And she thought of how rescue had finally come, not from God, but from a boy with kind eyes and a scrap of navy fabric. "I'm glad I lived long enough to find you again," she said. Liam squeezed her hand. "So am I." As the stars began to appear overhead, a knock came at the door. Oif answered it to find a young nurse from the radio station, her face flushed with urgency. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said breathlessly, "but Mr. O'Donnell needs to hear this. There's been a development." Oif frowned. "What kind of development?" The nurse handed her a piece of paper. "The Gardaí just released a statement. They're officially clearing Mr. O'Donnell's name. After your grandmother's broadcast, they reviewed the case files from 1965. They're issuing a formal apology and expunging his record." Oif's hand flew to her mouth. She ran to the garden, the paper clutched in her fist. "Liam," she called. "Liam, you need to hear this." And as she read the statement aloud, Nora watched Liam's face transform. 60 years of shame and guilt and false accusation lifted in an instant. He wept, his shoulders shaking, and Nora held him as the last light faded from the sky. The afternoon was cold when the car stopped in front of the stone house. Liam needed help getting out, but when he saw Nora at the door, he straightened himself as best he could. Time had separated them for 6 decades, but it had not erased mutual recognition. No words would be sufficient. He simply took from his pocket a small piece of navy blue fabric, the same fabric from 1964, and placed it in her hands. "Let's finish together," he said. Inside the house, Nora sewed the scrap onto the new quilt she had been making for her granddaughter. Offa watched in silence, weeping. Liam followed every stitch as if witnessing a miracle being mended. When the last thread fastened, Nora smiled and whispered, "Now I can rest." A few minutes later, she rested her head on his shoulder. The wall clock read 17:17. The next morning, Eofi woke alone in the house, with the fire still burning. On the table, the finished quilt and a note written by hand. "We did what love would do. May no one else need to sew with pain." In the distance, the radio repeated the recording of the confession, Nora's gentle voice echoing across Ireland. The days following the Gardaí's announcement had been strange and wonderful. Strangers stopped Nora on the street to thank her. Flowers arrived at the door daily. Letters poured in from across the country and beyond, from Australia, from America, from England. People sharing their own stories of survival and silence finally broken. But Nora's focus was not on the outside world. Her focus was on the small stone house in Ennis, on the guest room where Liam slept, on the hours they spent together by the fire, talking or simply sitting in companionable quiet. They had 60 years to catch up on, but they found they didn't need to rush. Some stories were told, others remained private, tucked away in the spaces between words. What mattered was not the past they had lost, but the present they had miraculously found. Oif watched them with a mixture of joy and heartbreak. Her grandmother seemed lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth had lifted a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. But she was also visibly weakening. The collapse had taken something from her, and despite the doctor's care, she was fading. Liam, too, was deteriorating. His heart, damaged by decades of stress and sorrow, was failing. The doctor had been frank with Oif. "Days, maybe a week. I'm sorry." But Liam refused to speak of death. Instead, he spoke of finishing. "There's one more thing I need to do," he told Nora on their 5th evening together. They were in the sitting room, the fire crackling, the rain drumming softly against the windows. "One more piece of sewing." Nora smiled. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket, the same worn tweed coat he had worn for years, and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in tissue paper. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a scrap of navy blue fabric, faded and frayed, but unmistakably the same as the piece he had given her all those years ago. "I kept it," he said quietly. "After they arrested me, after they took everything else, I kept this. I hid it in my shoe and they never found it." He looked at her, his blue eyes bright with tears. "I told myself that as long as I had this, I hadn't lost you completely. Nora reached out and touched the fabric, her fingers trembling. All these years. All these years, he echoed. She looked at the quilt she had been making for Ioifa, a patchwork of greens and blues and soft grays, the colors of home. Then let's finish it together. Let's add this piece and let it be the last. Liam nodded. The last and the most important. Oifa helped them set up at the small table by the window. The light was fading, but it was enough. Nora threaded the needle with steady hands, steadier than they had been in months, and together she and Liam began to sew. They worked slowly, taking turns with the needle, their hands sometimes touching as they passed it back and forth. Oif watched from the doorway, her phone recording the scene, capturing this moment that felt both ordinary and sacred. As they sewed, they talked, not about the past, but about the small things, the way the light caught the rain, the smell of turf smoke from a neighbor's fire, the sound of children playing in the street outside. They talked about nothing and everything, and Oif understood that this was what love looked like after 60 years and a lifetime of separation. Quiet, patient, complete. When the final stitch was in place, Nora tied off the thread and held up the quilt. The navy scrap sat in the center, surrounded by all the other pieces, like a heart in the middle of a life fully lived. "It's perfect," Liam whispered. Nora folded the quilt carefully and placed it in Ioifa's hands. "For you," she said. "So you'll always remember that love doesn't end. It just changes shape." Ioif hugged the quilt to her chest, unable to speak. That night, Nora asked Liam to stay with her in the sitting room. Ioif made up the sofa for him, bringing extra blankets and pillows, and though she offered to stay with them, Nora shook her head. "We'll be all right, love. Go and get some rest." Reluctantly, Ioif kissed them both and went upstairs. But she couldn't sleep. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmur of voices from downstairs. At some point in the night, the voices stopped. The house fell silent, and Oifi, though she didn't understand why, began to cry. When she came downstairs at dawn, the fire was still burning. It shouldn't have been. She knew she hadn't added wood before bed, but it was bright and warm, as if someone had tended it through the night. Nora and Liam were on the sofa, sitting upright, Nora's head resting on Liam's shoulder, their hands clasped together. They looked peaceful, almost as if they were sleeping. But Oif knew, even before she touched her grandmother's cool cheek, that they were gone. The wall clock read 1717, the same time Nora had whispered her final words, the same numbers that had marked the date of their first escape, a detail Oifa would only notice later, when the shock had faded and she could think clearly again. On the table beside them was a piece of paper folded once. Oifa opened it with shaking hands. "We did what love would do. May no one else need to sew with pain." The handwriting was Nora's, but beneath it, in a shakier script, Liam had added, "Thank you for bringing us home." Oifa sank into the armchair across from them, the note clutched in her hand, and wept. She wept for her grandmother, for Liam, for all the years they had lost. But she also wept with something like gratitude, because in the end they had found each other. They had spoken their truth. They had finished what they started. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small church in Ennis. It was standing room only, the pews filled with people who had heard Nora's broadcast and been moved to bear witness. The priest, a young man who had grown up in a different Ireland than the one Nora had known, spoke of love and courage and the power of truth. "Nora Flanagan," he said, "taught us that silence is not always golden. Sometimes it is simply silence. And breaking that silence, and no matter how frightening, no matter how difficult, is the most sacred thing we can do." They buried Nora and Liam together, in a plot overlooking the Shannon, beneath a rowan tree that would bloom white every spring. On the shared headstone, Oif had engraved their names in a single word: forever. In the weeks that followed, as Oif sorted through her grandmother's belongings, she found the quilts, dozens of them, stacked carefully in the wardrobe, each one a story, each one a memory. She kept some, donated others to the women's shelter in town, and gave one to the community radio station, where it was displayed in the lobby with a plaque that read, "In memory of Nora Flanagan, the woman who spoke." And every evening, as the light faded and the streetlights came on in Ennis, Oif would wrap herself in the quilt with the Navy Center and remember. She would remember her grandmother's courage. She would remember Liam's patience. She would remember that love, real love, The kind that survives everything is not always easy or simple or fair, but it is always, always worth it. There are stories that don't ask for justice, just to be told. And perhaps Nora Flanagan's is one of them. Not for revenge, but for liberation. She chose to speak when everyone expected silence. She chose forgiveness when the whole world would have understood hatred. How many people do you know who still keep pains hidden in quilts of old memories? How many times have you yourself stayed silent to avoid hurting others, when what you really needed most was to be heard? Think for a moment. If you had lived everything Nora lived, would you have had the courage to forgive? Or would you prefer to keep sewing the past, stitch by stitch until the end of your days? Sometimes, love is not what we receive, but what we manage to rebuild from what was taken from us. If this story touched you in some way, share it. Perhaps someone in silence needs to hear exactly this today. Like, follow and stay with us, because there are stories that don't end. They just wait for someone brave enough to listen to them.